Good morning, Dan and Amy and Holman Jenkins stuck the landing once again in the Wall Street Journal talking about the media and the Russian collusion hoax. If they had any grit, writes Jenkins, many of our senior reporters would be hopping mad now to learn they had been manipulated into reporting untruths to the public. If they had any grit.
Right, please.
Instead, many of them seem to be hanging around the same leakers and whisperers, hoping for new talking points to get themselves off the hook in the air clearing now coming. Fools become liars when they knowingly persist in their misrepresentations to preserve personal dignity and professional standing. By rights, the rectification should begin with the dismissal on competence grounds of the leadership in many newsrooms. It won't. But at least register in your own mind how routinely and sometimes completely press behavior is at odds with the values the press claims to represent. Jenkins arguing that the story of the Trump era will be how the D.C. press corps became more Trump-like than Trump in their opposition to Trump. And I'll tell you what, he has a surprising ally to a certain extent on that, and that is Van Gordon Sauter, who was the former president of CBS News in the 80s. He writes in the Wall Street Journal, the liberal-leaning media has passed its tipping point. I mean, this is a momentous statement considering the position that he held and the veneration he has for news organizations like his former employer. But he notes Dan Abrams, who's the founder of the website Mediaite, ABC's chief legal affairs.
Yeah, legal. Yeah, he's good.
He has a novel but valuable idea for the media, candor. He noted what Abrams said at a February conference. I think the first thing that would help is to admit that people in the media are left of center.17 Right. What a revelation that would be. But in terms of like conveying like we're honest about who we are, Van Gordon Sauter writes, it would be delightful if a publisher, an editor, or a reporter would just say, yes, I am left of center. I'm proud of it. I think our reporting is accurate. It best serves the public and the credibility of the media. So there. Publications open about their bias might feel freer to focus on the specifics, story selection, presentation, facts, fairness, balance. He writes that America won't reunite until far more people can look at a news story in print or on the screen and, of all things, believe it. Well, I think we're a long, long way from that halcyon vision of the press in terms of having any sort of credibility reestablished as they persist, as Holman Jenkins writes, with trying to come up with cover stories for being co-conspirators in the fraud that was perpetrated on the public. For more on this topic and a few others, we're pleased to be joined again by our friend John Hinderaker. He is the president of Center of the American Experiment and a contributor over there at powerlineblog.com, which is an excellent blog that requires daily reading. John, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, good morning. Glad to be with you.
How about former president of CBS News weighing in, at least in the direction of a Holman Jenkins and some of the things conservatives like us have been saying for, I don't know, a generation or two?
You know, it's a little ironic because my website, Powerline, really became well known in large part as a result of our role in exposing Rathergate. You remember that from the 2004 presidential campaign, when 60 Minutes tried to help John Kerry win the election by publishing lies about President Bush's service in the Texas Air National Guard. Turned out to be complete fiction, and we and others exposed it on the internet. Dan Rather got fired, and there were various consequences. But the idea that CBS News is a leftist organization that exists in large part for the purpose of helping the Democratic Party and hurting the Republican Party. And in that case, by the way, that story on 60 Minutes, that was coordinated with the John Kerry presidential campaign. You know,
really?
I mean, the idea that there ever was a time when news organizations like CBS were in any way objective or fair is a fantasy. And it's a little bit ironic that the former president of CBS News is now saying, gosh, maybe we should just admit we're leftists.
Well, I mean,
shouldn't they all come out and just admit it? I mean, really.
It's the Bill Buckley rule. You got to give people room to come over to your side, right, John?
I guess. I mean, you know, the real problem in my mind, And by the way, I want to go back to that Holman Jenkins piece for a moment, which I haven't read. I just heard your description of it. But I would, to some extent, take issue with it in this sense. I don't think it's really true that all of these reporters and editors at the New York Times and the Washington Post were fooled, by the leakers, and were played by the leakers. I don't think that's what happened. I think they were in league with the leakers in their effort to destroy President Trump. I don't think they regret that. I think they regret that the effort failed, but the fact that they lied, that they published lies, I think they'd do it again in a heartbeat.
No, I think that's the point he's ultimately getting at. If they had any grit, if this were honest that they had been fooled, they had been lied to, then they would be reacting differently than they are. And he points to David Axelrod recently interviewing Adam Schiff at his Institute for Political Skullduggery at the University of Chicago, and not asking the question about how do you explain your lack of evidence and your wrong-headed assertions for 3 years with respect to Russian collusion. The question wasn't even asked, wasn't even broached, and he references the privilege protection racket that goes on between the political class and the media class. So I think he's actually getting to your point. He's just saying, if they were reacting this way, you could believe they were fooled. Since they're not, they're not.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, how about the Pulitzer Prizes that got handed out for reporting about the Russia hoax that turned out to be completely false? Any chance those prizes are going to be given back? Any possibility reporters and editors will say, well, with hindsight, we shouldn't get the Pulitzer for reporting things that aren't true. No, that's not going to happen.
Wait, reporting things that aren't... Nicole Hannah-Jones got a Pulitzer this year for reporting things that we know aren't true ahead of the awarding of the Pulitzer. So, learning something is untrue after the fact. That's not the standard anymore.
You're absolutely. You're talking about the 1619 project of the New York Times, which exists for the purpose of slandering the United States of America, of destroying the reputation of the founders, of undermining the Constitution, and slandering the whole history of the United States falsely.
Now, you wrote a Powerline blog about normal Americans consider the shutdown. What do you mean by normal Americans?
Well, what I was writing about specifically in that post was sheriffs and county commissioners in small-town, rural Minnesota. And there was an account of a county commission meeting in central Minnesota that appeared in a local newspaper that I thought was kind of impressive because, the sheriff, for example, said, look, I took an oath to uphold the Constitution, and I have a very hard time seeing where our governor's orders here are constitutional. He says that the big businesses can be open, but small businesses have to shut. He said, I don't get that. And the county commissioners, I forget exactly what the vote was, but, a number of places around the state of Minnesota where I live, they voted to refuse to enforce our governor's shutdown order. And I guess my point really was that amid all of the hysteria that you see in the newspapers and television and so on about this virus, there are outposts of common sense. And I think those outposts are most likely to be found in the more rural parts of the country.
Speaking of your home state of Minnesota and your home state governor, Tim Walz, he said this about the exercise of freedom of religion in the land of 10,000 Lakes.
And then again, of course, I think the case that the president is making, and that may be up for debate in this country, of deeming houses of worship essential services. And that's one that we take into consideration.
So whether or not freedom of religion is essential is up for debate in Minnesota, according to your governor.
Yeah, well, he issued a series of orders, and one thing they had in common is that they discriminated against religion, against churches. And so he was actually asked a week or so ago in a press conference, well, how is it that a restaurant or bar can serve 50 people outdoors, but a church can only serve 10? And he went off on one of his trademark, he yammers and yammers away. And then finally he says, I have to admit, though, that the logic of your question is sound. He didn't have an answer. Bars can serve 50, churches can serve 10. And that's an example of the kind of unfairness in his orders that many people have commented on. He got sued. There's a public interest law firm here in Minnesota that sued on behalf of 5 or 6 small businesses and a couple of churches. And that case, where he had admitted publicly that the claim was correct, that he was discriminating against religion in violation of the First Amendment, as DOJ has pointed out over and over again, that there was a motion for a preliminary injunction on behalf of the 2 churches that was going to be argued today. And because that motion was imminent and because he'd admitted that the lawsuit was correct, over the Memorial Day weekend, he backed off on his restrictions on churches, even though he himself doesn't believe that they provide essential services.
Well, and specific to that, just compare and contrast here in Illinois, is 25% occupancy for churches, much like businesses. And this is the point. You can't treat similarly situated institutions differently. That's unconstitutional, particularly when it comes to what most people understand as an essential right, one of the 5 freedoms contained in the First Amendment.
Well, it is actually mentioned there in the Constitution.
Yeah.
Unlike some of the things that liberals like to pretend are fundamental rights, it's right there in the First Amendment, freedom of worship. And I've been appalled, frankly, at what sheep so many Americans have been, and how willingly, in the face of something that, to be perfectly honest, is not all that much of a crisis. I mean, here in Minnesota, more than 81% of our fatalities have occurred in nursing homes and assisted living facilities, and the median age of death has been, 82 or 83 years old. And I think, like most states, we classify a person as a COVID-19 death if he either had tested positive before he died or exhibited symptoms of COVID-19, which are basically the symptoms of a cold. And so a guy might be dying of cancer. He's in hospice care, expected to die within a week of cancer. But, if he's also coughing and sneezing, they'll chalk that up as a COVID-19 death. So, how many new people, additional people have actually died from this virus. And some people do, don't get me wrong. It's a disease. It's not a good thing, no doubt about that. But the idea that this is the kind of an emergency, a crisis that justifies suspension of the entire Bill of Rights, I think is far-fetched.
And I think those numbers, they say that they're underreporting some numbers, and they said that in our state. That is the reason why people don't trust the government officials, because we have the same problem here. 3 people were shot and they put them down as COVID-19 victims.
Well, I think they would do that in my state too if they happened to be sneezing, while they were shot. And I think you're right. I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of people are skeptical. It's very hard to get straight information. And the other thing is that the spin in the news is so relentless that you just have to take it all as relates to this virus, with a grain of salt. And then in the midst of this, we get news from the United Kingdom, from Great Britain. There are some people there, AstraZeneca, they're developing a vaccine, and they want to do human trials. And their big concern is that there may not be enough new cases of COVID-19 to be able to successfully test a vaccine. They've got 10,000 volunteers, and they need at least 20 of them to catch the virus, not to die from it or suffer from it, but just to catch it. Or they can't have a valid test. They're worried that they can't find 20 out of 10,000 people who will catch the virus. So obviously it appears to be dying out quite rapidly.
Well, right. One of the researchers actually said the sort of remarkable statement, we're hoping that the virus persists for a little while longer so we can get the number of people that we need.
So we can find people to test our vaccine on. Now, they're a little bit ahead of us on the timeline. They got it before we did, but we're not that far behind them.
John Hinderaker, president of Center of the American Experiment, and as we were talking about, the founder of PowerlineBlog.com. John, thanks so much for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Glad to be with you.
Thanks. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
You've made the switch, and it feels so good. You've switched to Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. the answer.
You've all probably heard of asbestos and know that it's dangerous. You may also know exposure to asbestos is the only known cause of mesothelioma, a deadly cancer. People who were exposed to asbestos decades ago are being diagnosed to this day with mesothelioma. That's because it can take as many as 30 or even 50 years to develop. But did you also know there is money to pay victims of asbestos exposure from years ago? An estimated $30 billion is available to help compensate victims and their families. If you or a member of your family have been diagnosed with mesothelioma, you may be able to receive some of this money without ever going to court or filing a lawsuit. Get a free legal review today. Call Sokolov Law at 1-800-972